Saint Luke, also known as Luke the Evangelist, is one of the four authors of the New Testament Gospels. He is traditionally believed to be a physician and a companion of Saint Paul. Saint Luke is credited with writing the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which provides a two-part account of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes compassion, forgiveness, and the inclusion of marginalized groups. In this series, Father Benoit Standaert unpacks the writings of Saint Luke, bringing to us a greater understanding of this evangelist and his writings. As we approach Advent, this series would be instrumental in our preparation for the Gospel according to Saint Luke.
Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Dear friends, we continue our analysis of the Gospel of Luke and try to grasp the artist Luke. We have seen the two first chapters, and we have seen also the last chapter. And already in both, by analysis, we could see how tactful, how subtle he is when he describes, takes elements over. Sometimes we do not know from where, especially for the two first chapters. But in 24 we see better that he develops things that he received from the tradition. Now I would like with you to see the rest of the Gospels from chapter 3 to chapter 23. How did he work? The work of an evangelist is to bring materials together that he could have found in oral and in written traditions, in a way that pleases him, just as an architect arranges windows and columns, openings and symmetries in harmony according to his plans. In general, we do not see the work of the evangelist architect, because we receive only one window, one wall, one door, but separated from the larger context. Today, we will try to make you sensitive for arches, lines that are built in a harmonious way with all kinds of reactions inside. I would like to start with a concrete example, chapter 16. It's a teaching on the use of riches. And Luke gives us, in the mouth of Jesus, a good example of using it and a bad example. We have clearly two teachings that you should hear together, which never arrives in the liturgy. One Sunday you get the first part, not complete, and one second day you receive the last part, but not complete. And you never hear the whole chapter 16 as a teaching with two enlightenments. In this presentation, you have each time a parable, two parables, both starting with exact the same sentence. There was a rich man, and the rest is changed. But the beginning is, there was a rich man. So you feel already the problematic is riches. How do you deal with that? At the same time, we discover that Jesus is speaking to different and opposed hearers. At one side, his disciples, which is, in general, a very positive public, and at the other side, the Pharisees or the opposition. When you read both passages together, you get a wisdom teaching, the famous teaching of the two ways. Like in Psalm 1, happy the man who does this and this. He's like a tree planted by streams of water. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind drives away. So by this antithesis, you get a message. It shows us a balanced approach to one question, like we find in the books of wisdom. Well, this model is very frequent, present in the work of Luke. He likes symmetrical presentations with winks, and little elements of pure opposition. Up to the reader then to make his choices in life. Now, this is just one example. How does he work over the entire gospel? Well, the general pattern is that he's following the Gospel of Mark, who was well built, and he respects that. He has taken more or less the entire Gospel of Mark. That's also a bit surprising. That means we don't need no more Mark when you are in the community where you read Luke. Probably that was the case, and the same with Matthew. Once you are in a community of Matthew, you have Mark integrated in the vision of Matthew. Now, very few stories are left behind. Stories of Mark are left behind in Luke. He follows him with great respect for the order. That is the most impressive thing. And he does that a lot more exactly than Matthew. Matthew can change the order of Mark. Luke always respects the succession, the sequence of the episodes in Mark. But there are two examples of a substantial change, and they are revealing the art of Luke. Exceptions that confirm the rule, as we say. In Mark 11, we have an episode that can shock us. Jesus goes to the city of Jerusalem. In the morning, he is hungry and sees a fig tree without fruit. 10 verses later, the day after, Peter noticed that the fig tree was condemned and dead to the roots. Between the two, we had Jesus' entrance in the temple with a strong condemnation. This tree disappears in Luke. When we arrive at the same moment of the narrative with Jesus in the morning before the city of Jerusalem, no tree. And the day after, no constatation that the tree is dry because there was no tree at the entrance. But in chapter 13 of Luke, we find a fig tree back. Not in a real story, but in a parable. There you see already the freedom and the creativity of Luke. A story becomes a parable. In John, we will see the opposite. A parable becomes a story. Twice in John. But here with Luke, a story becomes, a parable becomes an authentic story. No, in the other direction, I apologize. The real story became a parable. We see in chapter 13, verse 6 and 7, that Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. You see the parallel with what we could read in Mark 11. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. We should why should it be wasting the soil? Hard language, but in a parable, and remembering what Jesus has said against that tree and how it was operated the day after. This is a subtle way of saving the tree in Mark 11. 3 years. Some people has deduced from that remark that in the mind of Luke, Jesus had preached 3 years and came 3 times to Easter in Jerusalem. And that has been kept also because in the Gospel of John we have 3 feasts of Easter. So in the beginning, in chapter 6, and then from chapter 12 on, a feast of Easter. The predication of Jesus must have been 1 year to 3 years. But in Luke, it is just a detail in a narrative. And here we are tempted to see in the narrative an allegory in which we can find back the life of Jesus and his behavior 3 years long. The vineyard is the land of Israel. The fig tree is the vineyard. In the vineyard is Jerusalem with his temple. Will then the tree temple be destroyed? In the story, not yet. First I will work him. Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put manure on it. And that should be the last predication of Jesus in Jerusalem. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down. When Luke writes his gospel, the city has been destroyed and the temple profaned by the Roman armies of Titus. This is a good example of saving a difficult passage of Jesus with a fig tree at the entrance of Jerusalem, and then the fig tree as a parable in chapter 13, confirming that conversion is a necessity. We will see it later on. Now, another example, also very famous, is the catechesis on the greatest commandment in the law. In Mark, it is in the temple with the scribe that happened. The scribe asked the question, Jesus answered, and the scribe reacts positively on what Jesus had given as answer. Strangely enough, that story, that meeting, disappears in the list of the controversies in the temple according to Mark 11:12. There are 5 controversies in Galilee and 5 controversies in Jerusalem. Well, one of those 5 disappeared. But we find that question back in chapter 10 of Luke, a lot earlier, in a complete new setting. It starts by just then a lawyer, a nomikos, a specialist of the law, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. But the discussion goes on, different of what we hear by Mark. Who is my neighbor? And then follows the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do this and you will live. The same end conclusion at this story. We will see next time how this rearrangement in chapter 10 fits in a complete new context, in a balanced way, together with the teaching on prayer in chapter 11. These are the two most flagrant pericopes that Luke took away from the film of Mark and put them in a new way somewhere else in his gospel. For the rest, he kept the general structure of the narrative of Mark with immense respect. I have been thinking about that. Why such a respect when it is the order of the pericopes? And one of the reasons could be, this is the Gospel of Peter. It is the memory of Peter. Let us respect him, he who is the first of the 12 apostles, the very beginning of the tradition. Luke will not change the taxis, only the lexis of Mark. It's an interesting opposition linguistically. Lexis is the wording and the style. And Luke, in general, don't pick up the way of speaking and composing and writing of Mark, but respects always the taxis, the order of the units that Mark has presented. Taxis is the order. Lexis depends on the people you want to reach, your destinatarians. And Mark lives in Rome with people with a poor knowledge of the Greek. They are all strangers in Rome and speak Oriental tongues and the Latin. But the Greek of Mark is simple, transparent, easy, and popular, you could always say, as tongue. But the composition of Mark is well elaborated. That was the main goal of my thesis in 72, 78, when I worked at that. How has he composed his gospel? And I have shown, tried to show, the quality of rhetorics and dramatic composition that Mark knows as a skilled author. So far. Now, Luke goes also a bit further than just following Mark. He has eliminated one larger unit of the Gospel of Mark, the famous section on the loaves. It takes about 2 to 3 chapters, that section, in the Gospel of Mark, with the double multiplication of the loaves, once at the Jewish side of the lake and once at the pagan side of the lake. And in the middle, Mark had introduced a discussion on pure and impure, on clean and unclean. Well, Luke just keeps one multiplication and avoids all the rest. Why? Well, for him, the opening to the pagans so that both may share at the same table, that happens only in the beginning of the movement of the church. In the famous episode where Peter, after a vision, goes and eats with Cornelius in his house, the Roman centurion of Caesarea, a pagan. In the Gospel of Mark, it is the Evangelist himself who declares that by this saying of Jesus, he has made clear that all foods are clean. Mark 7:18 and 19 we read, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer. That's the word of Jesus. And then Mark, the evangelist, say, thus he declared all foods clean. Peter, in Acts 10 and 11, receives from God the message that all foods are clean. What he has cancelled is Mark 6:45 to 8:26, which is more than 2 chapters. We see here how free Luke is, how creative he permits to do that. Sometimes he is more theologian than historian. We have seen something similar with the apparitions of the risen Lord in Galilee in Mark. They are not taken over in Luke. The theologian of the city of Jerusalem as the city of the fulfillment of all the promises has won over the historian that he is also. Now, he introduced also twice a large section. And that is the main work of the evangelist Luke in comparison to Mark, with more or less nothing in common with the source of Mark. A very first insertion goes from Luke 6:17 to 8:3. Introduced just before the chapter of parables in Mark 4. Mark developed a speech of Jesus on the lake in the boat with 5 parables. Well, just before that, Luke has introduced a first, not so long section. One part is a discourse, the second half of chapter 6, parallel to the Sermon of the Mount in Matthew. And one is a unit of stories and dialogues, the whole chapter 7. We will have the opportunity to consider more in detail that special chapter 7 of high quality, very typical of Luke. But the second insertion is a lot longer in Luke, more than 7 chapters of his gospel. And he introduced it with 10, 12 verses at the end of chapter 9 of Luke. And in Mark, he has introduced it just at the articulation of chapter 9 and 10, after 9:40 and before Mark 10:13. This long insertion is one cathedral of 5 major treatises. When you say 5, you have always one in the middle, the third unit. There we should find the heart of the matter. Luke has balanced this entire section with great art.
Saint Luke, also known as Luke the Evangelist, is one of the 4 authors of the New Testament Gospels. He is traditionally believed to be a physician and a companion of St. Paul. St. Luke is credited with writing the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which provides a 2-part account of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes compassion, forgiveness, and the inclusion of marginalized groups. In this series, Father Benoit Standaert unpacks the writings of St. Luke, bringing to us a greater understanding of this evangelist and his writings. As we approach Advent, this series would be instrumental in our preparation for the Gospel according to St. Luke.